Okay, hello everybody. We're getting the slides up here and in place, and I hope you're seeing something. And does it say prologue?
Yes.
Okay, off we go. So and I introduced the topic, Age of the Strongman, this new book. And there's some things that have happened in the last week on that. Interviews with Gideon Rockman. He's very well spoken. And so Intelligence Squared, I don't know if you all are familiar with that. It's a very good podcast. A high-level interview, a lot of historical information. And one thing he said in this interview was, in the West, there's been a lot of wishful thinking when these strongmen first become in view in the public eye. So there was a lot of wishful thinking about Putin in the early years, that he could stabilize Yeltsin's Russia, and Erdogan, that he could reconcile Islam and democracy, and then in Ethiopia, Abiy, and that he could help solve the ethnic problems, and he got a Nobel Prize. And it turns out that was wishful thinking, because now they're in this bitter civil war. And Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince in Saudi Arabia, that he maybe could drag them into the 21st century, but he's turned out to have a very dark side, murdering journalists in particular. And then the point is that the three most populous countries in the world are either controlled by autocrats or autocrat wannabes. So she is an autocrat. Trump and Modi certainly had tendencies. And so that's a little sobering. But then you go around the world, and there are a lot of all these people claiming to speak for the common man, undermining liberal institutions, and in some cases, developing personality cults. Even in Europe, Boris Johnson, arguably, but for sure in Hungary, Viktor Orban, and in Africa, Jacob Zuma in South Africa was a terrible example of a populist. He's gone now. And then in Asia, add Duterte in the Philippines. He's on his way out, though, term limited, and he's leaving, which is good, because sometimes these autocrats or autocratic tendencies or populists resist leaving, and that's what we're having congressional hearings about. And then in the Middle East, in addition to Erdogan, you could argue that Netanyahu had a certain populist appeal. Right in our own Americas, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Ortega in Nicaragua, even in Mexico, AMLO. And in Venezuela and Cuba, they've had autocratic tendencies for decades now. So it's sobering, but Rockman offers some hope. He thinks that an autocrat has a 30-year life expectancy. And there are certain flaws within that model, the seeds of their own destruction. They get poor advice, and they really need advice because they think they know everything. But why do they get poor advice? Because they have so much power that there's a fear to tell people to speak truth to power, to give solid advice. We saw that, of course, with Mao Zedong China and the Great Leap Forward, where he was getting all kinds of glowing agricultural reports, and that they were false, and there was famine. Reportedly, up to 5 to 10 million people died from famine because of these false information. Right now, we see China struggling with the zero tolerance. They're the last country in the world to stubbornly maintain zero tolerance in the face of a highly communicable variant. So we'll see how that works out. Day by day, seems to be getting worse and worse. And then you could say that maybe Putin got bad advice on the Ukraine from his military. So these people maybe fall from their own weight. In this line, the weaknesses of a autocracy. This is a brilliant movie. It's a comedy, and it has Steve Buscemi playing Khrushchev. And what happened the week that Stalin died. I highly recommend it. It's funny, but it's got some hard truths. Speaking of Stalin, he did something in 1945, I discovered, that kind of undermines Putin's argument that Ukraine's not a country. Stalin wanted the Ukraine to be considered a separate country, so communism would have an extra vote in the United Nations. So there you have that one example of Russia itself deeming Ukraine a nation. But the second, and we talked about it last week, and Carol noted that it was a real contradiction and great hypocrisy in Putin's current attitude. But the Budapest memorandum, where the Ukraine gave up all those nuclear weapons for certain guarantees that Russia signed off on, and that Britain and America were supposed to guarantee. So the other thing Carol sent was Snyder's Easter essay, and I'd recommend it. He goes deeper into this religious fusing of this peculiar branch of Orthodox linking with Russian nationalism and the idea of a strong leader, almost to the point of fascism. And we have a hard time defining fascism. We can remember the 14 points of being a fascist, but if you look at the idea of Russia as a victim, an innocent victim, persecuted by a broken world, and the only way to heal Russia is to have a very, very strong leader, so strong that he eliminates the difference between the people and the ruler. So this is the thinking of Ivan Ilyich, a philosopher that Putin reads and quotes. Ilyin claims that the Ukraine did not exist. That's part of his outlook. And Putin quotes him. So this is important, what people believe. And then there's another guy that's alive. Ilyin's dead. But this guy has talked about Euro-Asianism in Putin's Russia. And that kind of created a rabbit hole for me to try to think that through. It's a strong political movement. And the idea is that Russia doesn't belong to either European or Asia, that it's instead a bridge, a geopolitical a standalone civilization that's a bridge, unlike the West and unlike Asia. And Putin apparently is a fan of this thinking. And so if you look at the traces of Asianism in Russia, well, currently Putin's Russia, Dan sent in this information on the Russian soldiers in the Ukraine participating in Buddhist services. And these are Central Asians from the former Soviets who are loosely linked with Russia through their version of NATO. So they had to give up the Warsaw Pact when they lost all their European satellites, but they have reconstructed a security agreement with the former Central Asian Soviets. And they have volunteered to serve with the Russian army in the Ukraine. And it reminded me of pictures I saw from World War II that struck me when American soldiers met Russian soldiers on the Elbe. The American soldiers under Eisenhower coming from the West and the Russian soldiers having fought their way into Germany and meeting and fraternizing. And I was struck by the number of Asian faces. We've already talked about Shoigu, who is Tuvan. His father was Tuvan, which is Mongolian. He had a Ukrainian mother, and we've been keeping an eye on him because he had a Ukrainian mother. How was this going to go down? But he has reappeared, and this is from last week, sitting with Putin. Other things to note, people are looking for telltale signs of how Putin's doing physically, but Dan noted that how much he's slumping, and somebody else posted a video of Putin walking across the room to meet Shoigu, and it looked like you could make the case that he had Parkinsonism, and there was some pill rolling. So, you know, we don't know, and all this is conjecture. Some things are just too interesting to not mention, so sorry. But I want to get to the bigger question of the clash of civilizations. The theory behind that whole thing is Samuel Huntington was the leader thinker of this when it was apparent that Islam was not going to accept the end of history, that Islam was not going to accept the liberal settlement of the end of history, and as formulated in the 90s. I think that's interesting to look at this and put it this phenomenon of Eurasianism in Huntington's terms. First, the color coding. We don't have to. I just want you to look at the first two: Western civilizations and Orthodox civilizations. And this neo-Eurasianism, you can make an argument that now this light blue area, which is the Orthodox countries with Orthodox influence, is what Dukin's talking about with this being a bridge from not Europe, not Asia, but being a bridge, and so becoming even more of a separate civilization or culture. It's interesting. Other people have analyzed to see what countries really are Western, and they came up with another category that is the light blue, which at the time they came up with this analysis, they thought, well, these are the countries, they're not quite fully liberal yet, but they're in the process of joining the West, or maybe they're torn. Well, for sure, Russia has been torn within the last 2 months out of the Western orbit, and is kind of drifting alone in this neo-Asianism. Here's another analysis, fairly recent, showing the Western countries and without Russia in it. This is an interesting website. It's interactive and it's kind of fun. So what's different about Russia that would make it Asian? Well, you got to remember, while the West was going through the Reformation and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, Russia was being ruled by the Mongols, the Golden Horde, who had inherited all the territories that Genghis Khan had captured. And the Mongols were pretty harsh. They were pretty brutal. And so if we see more brutality in Russian culture, Russian history than other places, it might be the influence of the Mongols. This is Russian boyars, aristocrats, being punished under the victors of a battle, the Mongol table, where they sit and they have a meal with these poor boyars being crushed underneath. This was Genghis Khan's operation. If you didn't surrender, this is what you got. If you surrendered, Genghis Khan was fairly tolerant of other ways of, and I think this has come across in the Silk Road, Ramsey's talking about. So who were the boyars? That's, I said, I keep running into this. The boyars were simply the descendants of Vikings. So if you see the word boyar, just think Viking. And of course, the Vikings are recognized in Russian history because they set the clock. This is according to the time of the czars. You remember when we were doing the time of the czars in 1862, they celebrated their millennium of Russian history with the arrival of the Vikings. And the descendants of the Vikings then emerged as the upper class in Kievan Rus, and they became the nobility and produced some rulers like Alexander Nevsky, who we've talked about, and that the ultimate authority in these dynasties was the notion of the good czar, that the czar is always good. He may not be present in your life, but he's there ultimately as the ultimate authority if you can just get your case to him. God is high and the czar is far away was the lament when you couldn't get this good czar to come and help you. Well, that's certainly familiar. When we were doing China, heaven is high and the emperor is far away. This notion of a ultimate, fair, just ruler. You may not see him in your life, but there it is. And this saying was started during the Yuan dynasty, which was the Mongolian dynasty. Like Russia, China had a Mongolian dynasty. It was shorter than the Golden Horde's suppression of Russian independence, but there it was. And it's often used as a lament against the local corruption. My life may be bad, but it's these local guys. It's not the system. It's not the great leader far away. And the power of the boyars continued. There's a continuity, and when Ivans took power, the boyars were still kingmakers. They could make or break a czar. I think Ivan the Terrible or Ivan the Fearsome got his name from cracking down on the boyars. The Rurikid lineage. So this is the lineage that comes with the boyars and the Vikings. They ran out of producing good leaders, and so there was a different group of aristocrats that started the Romanov dynasty in 1613. The Romanovs just outmaneuvered all the other boyars, and so the confusing word boyar disappeared when Peter the Great just started using Western titles. So now we don't see people referred to as boyars. They're princes and dukes. But all along, there's continuity with the Vikings, which seems strange, except when you think about our history and the continuity of the Vikings who took over Normandy in France, and you had the Norman invasion of England, which evolved into Great Britain, which of course we inherited a lot of their traditions, especially the legal system, the adversarial system. And the Romanovs ended suddenly. The whole family was executed in 1917 with the communist revolution. So that ended that. And who would have done such a thing? I mean, it wasn't just the Tsar, it was his wife and all his kids. Who would do that? Well, just to maybe tongue in cheek bring this full circle, a guy who was 1/4 Mongolian. And when you look closely at Lenin's face, you can see that. And a lot of prominent people in Russia continue to have a Mongolian line. So, by the way, we had a little side argument among some of our video attendees about fellow travel and who was a fellow traveler of Putin. And I didn't want to get into it, but I just had to remember this quote by Lenin, where he used the term useful idiot. That was people who were sympathetic, socialists who were sympathetic. He didn't believe in socialism. He thought communism, you had to go the full way. But that some of those socialists could be useful in idiots in achieving Bolshevik goals. And I don't know, I won't say who's a useful idiot in that story. I want to talk about this guy, Dugan, again. He has come up with some really bizarre ideas. One, a real life image of a Russian being a boy being crucified. And Timothy Snyder takes a close look at that crazy idea and just points out that where it was supposed to take place in Lenin Square of this town, that there is no Lenin Square in that town. So it was easily disprovable. But it's the kind of propaganda we were talking about earlier that apparently the Russian people are suffering under with their state media under Putin's control. And then this whole notion of Ukrainian Nazis. This again is Dugan, and Ukrainians are always guilty because of who they are, and Russians are always innocent no matter what. And this is why we're getting these atrocities that we see, the execution of mayors of small towns. There was a woman mayor who was executed, and they found her grave and reburied her. And so how can you come up with this idea of Ukrainian Nazis and commit these atrocities? And part of the religion almost is this idea of suffering. And Putin quotes the Bible in celebrating the death of Russians who have died in battle, and that the Russian soldiers' death makes the nation more unified than ever before. And I think Timothy Snyder uses the term a cult of death. And he also points out that the religious theory is that God's will is that Russia and Ukraine should be united. So it's a religious belief almost. And interestingly enough, Putin's deadline for getting this Ukraine incursion done with is May 9th, which is coming up because that's a victory day when Russia always celebrates the great victory of World War II. And it was a great victory. And we see that the Russian people have had great victories at Stalingrad in particular. And when Napoleon came, they burned down their capital rather than give Napoleon any food or water. And that was a terrible defeat for Napoleon. Just quoting Timothy Snyder so much, I'll just give him a plug. He's got new versions of books out with a special attention to what's happened in the Ukraine, because that's his specialty. And he's even put out a new edition of a older history book, Bloodlands, focusing the new edition more on the Ukraine. So I've appreciated his insights, and I appreciate Carol for showing us that. Carol also mentioned the Ukrainian nationalism project in 1989, and that sent me to the books. And you can find a wiki page on the suppression of the Ukrainian language through the centuries, if you want more information on that, and the attempts to Russify the Ukraine, starting in the 17th century and going down to our own, the current one. just one final comment on how the rest of the world is seeing this war. And we had hoped that the rest of the world would condemn Russia aggression, but that a lot of the world, that criticism has been muted. We've talked about that before, and I want to just revisit that. I use the word third world in discussing this with some of our young residents at the hospital. I'm involved in their education still, and we were talking about this. And I said third world, and they said, "Oh, Dr. Lee, we don't say that anymore." And it was because they thought third world was pejorative. But third world in the 50s and 60s was an acceptable term. And this third world was embraced by all these leaders, Nehru, Nkrumah, Nasser, this is Sukarno, Tito, and now they are the non-aligned movement. I guess that's what I should start learning to say. Is a mighty bloc, particularly in the southern hemisphere. And this analysis looks at full members and then the observers, which includes, interestingly enough, Mexico and other scattered countries that are more non-aligned. Brazil is not aligned. Peru has voted with Russia on all the efforts in the United Nations. So, and we had this. We showed that. How this vote went for throwing Russia out of the Human Rights Council, and they won. But 140 countries had voted to condemn the Ukrainian invasion in the first place. And so, who are these 93 countries that voted for it? Well, that's our allies in this are in the dark blue, and those that are against are highlighted in orange. And there's this is Peru, quite inexplicable until Bob pointed out that they've got beefs, and so the Economist came out with a really good analysis of how's come the non-aligned movement is mad at us, and they're concerned that sanctions on Russia have echo effects. And that it's going to affect their economies, and we certainly see that in the wheat production. That's not directly a problem with the sanctions. It's a problem with Russia bombing the Ukraine. But they also look at the West as making things seem global when they're not, at least not to some of the distant non-aligned nations, that this is a local conflict between Russia and a neighbor. And we're making a big deal out of it, but we ignore human rights abuses elsewhere. And in fact, sometimes we are guilty of policies that result in abuse of human, and our invasion of Iraq, with all the people who were died and all the people who were forced to leave their homes as refugees. That's about 20% of the population at one time or another. And we did that in defiance of the UN. We've talked about that before. And they also think that the West is being too tight-fisted in assisting the non-aligned nations to deal with climate change. And their argument is that it's the West that created it with their profligate use of energy during industrialization. And now that they've reached the point where they can start producing things industrially, they're being told they can't. And then finally, the point was, hey, how quickly and how much did you make COVID vaccines for the whole world a priority? And there's certainly an argument there as well. So this whole concept in 1992, the end of history, it's true economically that the communism economically was finished and that the free market had won. So economically, it was, in a sense, the end of history. And we see that in the world gross national product. And even China uses the free market. And Putin is on record. He has argued with neo-socialists in Russia that the free market is the way to go. So that's the economics of that is settled, and in that sense, the strict state control of the economy ended in history. But now the new ideological struggle is what's the best way to manage power? Is it really top down like they do in China, or should it still be bottom up, where you have democracies with consent, where it's possible to remove leaders with a vote? And where there's a peaceful passage of power. And it sort of led me to pull out the model I've been working on for a couple of years since I started the series in world history. And it was an answer to the question, what is civilization? And the way I visualize it is from bottom up, that when we're tribal and we're clans and we're hunter-gatherers, there is violence. And then all the steps of civilization try to limit violence in different ways. So in feudal times, you had dynasties and then monarchs, one king, monarch. And that could reduce the number of tribes and clans fighting. And then if you had could institutionalize a police as a monopoly in your civilization, that would limit violence. So I started thinking about this model in the case of Russia, and I'll just, if you'll indulge me for one more minute on this, I think what we're seeing in Russia is a police monopoly on violence. The Siloviki, the continuation of the KGB security intelligentsia having all the power, and we're going to see with the example of Browder how that's been misused. And then we've been talking, the majority of time today is how religion has sprouted in Russia as a strange new variant of Christianity. And it's given Putin a lot of power, but at the price of maybe law and ethics, which is the next step in the model. And all of this has to be consistent with trade and prosperity. But in Russia's case, they have become pretty much a natural resource economy. Their hydrocarbon trading, oil and gas, it is what gives them any prosperity. If they didn't have oil and gas, they're not producing much industrially. And then we've always talked about the next step to reduce violence in your society is some sort of institutional a process of consent. It really started with the Roman Senate, but that the Roman emperors kind of made a short end of that. The Roman power lasted 1,000 years, and most of that was not with a functioning Senate. But what we've seen in our Enlightenment and the glorious revolution in Britain and our own Constitution, the longest lived democracy, putting forward a notion of consent. And of course, on top of all this in the Enlightenment was reason and science. But the interesting thing for me is that in Russia, the elections, I don't know if Putin could lose an election. And we talked about the Navalny TV special and his story, and how we can't really talk about Russia as being the power being managed by the consent of the governed. But the paradox for me with Russia is these two things. They still continue to do well in science, and they continue to excel in the arts. Just think of ballet and Russian dance. Think of Chekhov, think of Tchaikovsky, think of Dostoevsky. So for me, I'm having to rethink this whole model of the realms in which civilization can be forged, because there does seem to be Russian exceptionalism. Okay, thanks for indulging me. I just want to put an exclamation mark on this problem that started really with the Mongols. That the Russians have had a lot of troubles. You can argue, you can look at the times of troubles in every country, but their transition from the Rurik dynasty, the Romanovs, was particularly rocky. A lot of abuses came out of that. Peter went through a time of troubles, Catherine, and then more in the last 2 centuries, the soldiers who had been successful attacking Napoleon. So you remember Napoleon had to retreat after the Russians burned Moscow, and then Alexander I gave chase to Napoleon and took troops into Paris. Those veterans, when they came back from their successful invasion of Paris, had been infected with the Napoleonic ideals of liberalism, if you will. Certainly were more anti-monarchists. And that's what you could argue was one of Napoleon's main achievements, was to weaken the monarchy all across Europe. And then times of troubles in the 1860s, you free the serfs, and that really reshuffled the social order. We've talked before about how that affected the Russian society, their strength, their economy, their military, and to the point that they were defeated by Japan, an emerging nation, a nation that quickly emerged with the Meiji reforms. And then again in the 1990s, when communism fell, and the shock therapy to try to suddenly move the Russian economy into a market economy. And then when Yeltsin took power, and then you had different elements of society against reforming, and he had to bomb his own parliament. He killed 145 people bombing the parliament. And so what do we think Putin has learned from all this? And Fiona Hill comes up with an interesting theory. Her book is, I think, worth reading, even though it doesn't hang together in what she's trying to do. But the bits and pieces together are interesting. And she thinks there is a theory of Russian law that says, hey, in our case, we need a constitutional monarchy. We need a strong central government because of all these times of trouble that we've had. So we need a strong central authority. And when you look at the rewritten constitution, the Russian president has a lot more power than the president of the United States, or even the president of France. And there's a whole strain of legal theory that says we should be like a constitutional monarchy. And we go through European history and look at where that failed or succeeded. Just to finish up, one of our video viewers wanted to make a point to recommend this. We were talking about it earlier, the CNN documentary. It showed for the first time last night, but it's going to be available repeat, and Carol told us it's very good. A couple of more thoughts I had about thinking about Russia and the Ukraine, and what is the relationship between Russia and the Ukraine. And I found a couple of analogies with our own relationship to Britain. I'll just roll out for you. It's like Putin's logic on the Ukraine is we share so much common history that Russia can annex it. Well, that would be like us saying we share so much history with Great Britain, like the Magna Carta or Alfred the Great, that we should be able to annex Britain. That's how ridiculous it is. And then what is Russia actually doing to the Ukraine? Well, the Ukraine in 1990 had the opportunity to declare its independence, and it did. And now Russia bombing Kiev, isn't that a little bit like Britain after they lost America, returning in 1812 and burning down the White House and trying to claw back some of their lost territory? Anyway, thanks for indulging me. I think that's one of the reasons I do it, and I hope you all keep feeding me with feedback, and I hope some of these sessions you'll give me the feedback once we finish with the actual history, that you give me the feedback real time, and we can do it, or keep on emailing. I appreciate it. So the Ukraine, where would we leave off? We left off in Georgia, and George Bush, after Putin went into Georgia and grabbed 2 bits of land and took it away from Georgia, settled land disputes there. George Bush urged NATO to offer Georgia and the Ukraine membership, and the Ukraine. And we've already seen evidence that Putin's Russia tried to cut short the Orange Revolution by poisoning Yushchenko, the spokesman, the leader of the Orange Revolution. A terrible case of acne caused by dioxin. So, what lessons did Russia take from Georgia? They took a lot of casualties and a lot of deficiency in the mobilization of Russia. The Russian army became evident. It was a first large-scale military operation, and they made it a priority to rebuild their military and develop new weapons, which Putin went at great lengths to tout about 5 years ago with this scary cartoon showing all the weapons that Russia had developed. That in retrospect should have been a red flag. And the next opportunity after 2008 to intervene was going to be the Ukraine. So you could argue Georgia was a spring training. So in 2008, he gets back. He has to leave the presidency after 2 terms. That's the Constitution, and he follows the Constitution. Now, here's a bit of new information that I get Fiona Hill. I talked about his relationship to Sobchak when he returned to St. Petersburg in 1990, and he was his deputy mayor. And Sobchak had been a legal scholar that under whom Putin had studied when he was a law student in the 1970s. So he is attuned to the law, and they switch places. He and Medvedev switch places, and he becomes prime minister, and Medvedev holds the position of presidency for him until he can return and run for election in 2012. But there's another wave of NATO in 2009, Albania and Croatia. And we've already talked about the 4th wave might be the Ukraine and Georgia. The 4th wave turned out to be Montenegro and North Macedonia, and that was 2017 over Russia's strong objections. All right, so this is where things get interesting. Hillary Clinton comes in as Secretary of State following Putin's invasion of Georgia. Does she hold that against him? No, she says, we know what W. Bush said about NATO and stuff, but we're going to reset. And that's what she called it. And that's what they were going to try. Putin entertained Obama. It was maybe going to work. This is Michael McFaul, who sits at that point on the Security Council in DC. He later becomes the ambassador to Russia, who has a terrible, terrible relationship with Putin, who has followed McFaul and knows his thinking, and he flobs him off from the very first minute. They don't have 1 minute of rapport, so Hillary is upset with the way McFaul's being treated, and so in 2010 she repeats what W. Bush said. Hey, the door is opened for Ukraine and NATO. in 2010, something else happens. The candidate that Putin backed in 2004, he miraculously returns. He is, you'll remember, from the Donbass, and he comes back and he runs against the Orange candidate, and he wins. So that's a victory for Putin. But something else happens in 2011, and that is the big protests in the major cities of Moscow. And I emphasize cities because it's not the urban areas. They have the same kind of split that we do politically. And so it's cold, and they talk not about the Orange Revolution, is what they talked about in the Ukraine, or the Rose Revolution, what they talked about in Georgia. They talk about the Snow Revolution, and they want fair elections, and they don't want Putin to return as president. Remember, he's been 4 years, accepted the demotion and been prime minister. And now he wants to return, and they don't think this is a good idea in the cities. Their accusations are what we've been talking about: authoritarianism, rigged elections, lack of civil liberties, corruption, particularly among the kleptocracy, the oligarchs, and political repression. By the way, corruption and money, Fiona Hill does not accept the argument that we've heard that Putin is in it for money, that he is a multimillionaire, a billionaire. Some people say the richest man in the world. She and her colleague do not buy that. They do not see any evidence of that whatsoever, which makes me wonder I know where we got the information. It was in a PBS Frontline documentary. So they're demanding Russia without Putin, but what's Putin's response? He is really afraid of a color revolution in Russia. And so he mounts an anti-orange protest. So he's playing the Ukraine card in response to this show of protest against him. And he is pretty sure Hillary Clinton is behind it. He is pretty sure. And so that explains a lot about the 2016 election between Trump and Clinton. The history is important here. And so who organizes these revolutions and gets people to come in from the rural areas? Well, it's the church, and it's the FBS, Siloviki, the survivors of the security state, the police, if you will. I think Timothy Snyder makes the point that this extreme view of religion is what is going to be required to overcome the obvious kleptocracy that the Russian people suffer under. It's not that Putin's getting rich; it's that the inequality in Russia is bad. Navalny, who we talked about, covering up such things of such eyes requires a lot of ideology. He makes specific accusations in an op-ed for the New York Times, and says that the Russians don't want the chaos in the Ukraine or even Kyrgyzstan. So he mobilizes everything that he can to counteract what he perceives as America dabbling in Russian politics. So I think this is where be a good place to stop. Putin does win the election, and when we return next week, we'll start the years leading up to the invasion and the taking of Crimea in 2014. So, any comments, questions?
So, John, this is Carol. I have a question about Putin's, you talked about his winning the elections, and I think there's a big split between what happens in the rural areas versus the cities, but I hadn't thought about the suburbs. Are they also very pro-Putin? Because I think in the cities they're not very pro-Putin. They're more, they get more news.
Yeah, I didn't go into that, but I can look at that. It's certainly relevant now. What are the suburbs? Are they getting any information about the Ukraine? I'll look into that.
Right, and just as a complete sidebar, I was listening. I can't remember which podcast it was, but they were talking about the sanctions that we've imposed and sanctioning and then holding the mega yachts.
Oh yeah,
oligarchs have. But if I understood them correctly, we, being the United States government, we can hold them, but we have to maintain them so that when we return them, they have to be in the same condition that they were when they were taken over, and that's really expensive. So can't we just take them?
I don't know. As contraband?
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm gonna. My history is gonna stop at 2014. So
don't believe me.
I know no more about what's going on right now than you do. I just want to make sure we know what happened up through what we can call history. And
I didn't know when I was going to look up what happened in Kyrgyzstan, because I didn't know what did happen in Kyrgyzstan. Are we going to talk about that?
They've had a lot of instability in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and well, we know most recently Kazakhstan. They needed Russian troops to come, and all these countries, by the way, are members of what they're NATO, right? That I talked about earlier. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, I was wondering, does Putin have any reason? I mean, does he have evidence that Hillary Clinton was actually, doing those things, or is it something he imagined? Or
no, with the Maidan protests, there's clear evidence that we were involved in, and this is the next week, the 2014. Hillary Clinton's right-hand woman, Victoria Nuland, was handing out cookies at the Maidan. So imagine if in the Occupy movement, Russian ambassador had come and handed out cookies in New York City. I don't know. I'm going to have to stop here, and I'll come right back. Okay.